Growing up, I was raised by my grandparents. My grandparents might be a bit younger than some, but my grandpa, of course, he loved introducing me to his favorite movie action heroes. Like those John McClane, The Terminator, Sylvester Stallone's character in that Demolition Man movie. Big fan of the movie, not gonna lie. Just names slip my mind. But of course, the list goes on. So, of course, one of our favorite Christmas movies to watch together every year was the Arnold Schwarzenegger classic, Jingle All the Way. Welcome to Geekborn, and this is the third flick of Christmas. And on this Movie Monday, we'll be covering this classic, Jingle All the Way. Now, it's been a few years since I've seen this, so let's see if it still holds up and I enjoy it just as much as I used to. We're going to start with the scene. It's the Turbo Man show. It's a bit Power Ranger-esque in the way that it looks, and we eventually see the main boy of the movie, Jamie, who is played by Jake Lloyd. This guy, who a couple years later would end up playing young Anakin Skywalker in The Phantom Menace. Arnold, plays Jamie's father, and honestly, I'm just calling him Arnold throughout this whole talk and movie. His name's Howard, but he's Arnold Schwarzenegger, so we're just gonna call him that. He's the father. Of course, he has trouble keeping his promises, and he works way too much. That's why he has trouble keeping his promises, 'cause how much he works. He's supposed to be at his son's karate class, but it's too busy answering phones, and he goes through, and on his way there, he gets a speeding ticket. Not going so great. He shows up to the gym, and everyone is gone. And of course, we meet Ted at the karate practice. He's Arnold's neighbor and a single father who has a son who's friends with Jamie, and he's super into Liz, which is Arnold's wife. Arnold comes home to Ted putting Christmas lights on his house because Ted is honestly just trying too hard. But Arnold comes in to see his son. His son's super upset because he wasn't there. Now, Arnold's trying too hard to try to get his son happy, but he ends up asking what he wants for Christmas. And his son wants the Turbo Man action figure. They end up playing and talking about Turbo Man and doing all kinds of fun stuff. This son father bonding. Liz ends up asking Arnold if he found the Turbo Man action figure or picked one up a couple of weeks ago because he was supposed to. Of course, he lies and told her, "Yeah, I picked that up. Of course I did." But the next day is Christmas Eve and he didn't pick it up, so he has to go to the office where he says that the doll is, but he's actually going to try to see if he can track one of these guys down. Ted ends up stopping Arnold on his way to the car and mentions that he already has a Turbo Man wrapped underneath the Christmas tree for his son. Arnold shows up at the toy store. There's a huge crowd outside waiting to get this store to open. Then we meet the mailman, played by Sinbad. Also, know that the mailman has a name, but I'm just calling him Sinbad because it's Sinbad. He's brought into the picture, and we start spouting all these conspiracy theories, just off the wall rants before the store opens, and they rush in, trample over the one worker there. Turns out Turbo Man's already sold out. Of course it is. There's a young Chris Parnell who plays a worker here at the toy store. He just straight up laughs in Arnold's face because he claims that he wants one of these figures. And of course, everybody already knows Turbo Man's been sold out. There was one in the store a lady got on layaway, and Arnold and Sinbad hear about this, so they fight and rush to try to get it. After Arnold wins this little spat that they have, he goes through and runs after her, but he scares the lady off, so she drives off in her car, being scared off by this big dude chasing her down. That's when we get this montage of Arnold going around looking at all these different kinds of toy stores, hoping to try to find the Turbo Man figure, getting laughed at all along the way. Ted shows up at Arnold's house and takes over baking and watching the kids so Liz can go shower. Of course, then Arnold calls his house, but Ted answers the phone. Back in the old day when we had house phones and whatnot, everybody's on their cell phones. Ted is trying to make Arnold jealous and talking about, he's got these cookies where we get the famous scene.
Put that cookie down! Now!
Of course, Sinbad also happens to be using one of these ancient forms of technology known as a payphone right next to Arnold. They end up running into each other. Sinbad wants to form a team so they can try to track these down together, if they would be lucky to find more than one at a time. They hear there is a late shipment that is sent to a toy store, so they rush off in their separate vehicles. But Arnold ends up backing up into a police motorcycle parked behind him, and of course, it's the same cop that gave him the speeding ticket earlier in the film. We get the toy store, and they're doing some kind of weird raffle with these numbers on these bouncy balls. uh, Arnold goes through and tells these people that Sinbad's character has more than one bouncy ball, so they tackle him. And then Arnold chases the one bouncy ball that fell out of Sinbad's hand across the mall. A little girl ends up with it, and so of course he chases after the little girl. He ends up grabbing the girl's face because she puts it in her mouth, and a bunch of women call him a perv and start beating him with their purses, because they think he's a perv and trying to touch on this daughter. So like, I get it, but um, he goes through and he's talking about getting this Turbo Man doll in front of the mall Santa, who's played by Jim Belushi. He hears that Arnold needs the doll and claims that he's able to get one. They head off to this rundown looking area where there's a warehouse. When we go inside the warehouse, it's just a bunch of people dressed up, different shapes and sizes of Santas and elves. They hand him this wrapped box. Arnold opens it. They tell him not to, but he opens it anyway. He touches the button on the toy. It only speaks Spanish. And once he opens up the box, it starts falling apart. It costs him about $300, so he starts insulting all these Santas. And the Santa, played by Jim Belushi, provokes him into a fight, and they end up going at it. And he ends up fighting a whole bunch of Santas. I want to see if there is an edit somewhere where somebody has Arnold as the Terminator fighting all these Santas. There's also a Santa who's Giant Santa. That's what he's credited on IMDb, and he is played by The Big Show. Arnold ends up winning until an elf tases him up in his butt. The police end up showing up. Santas scatter. Arnold finds a toy badge. It tends to be an undercover cop. All the things he's doing super illegal in this movie, but he gets away from the craziness, goes through, drives off, but his car breaks down on the interstate, so he has to push his car to the nearest stop. He goes to a diner. Sinbad also happens to be at this diner where they chat for a few, and we see Jamie and Johnny having a talk with the reindeer that Ted got, and Johnny tells Jamie that his dad started being all this extra whenever he ended up getting divorced, and that maybe Jamie's parents should get a divorce to, fix their stuff. Jamie ends up running into the house as Arnold ends up calling the house on a payphone, and they get in a fight because Jamie wants his dad to be there, and Arnold's just trying to do this so he can get his son this toy for Christmas. Realistically, he's just trying to do what he can to be a decent dad. But it's not working out. He gets off the phone, and the radio chimes in. The DJ is talking about having the chance to win yourself a Turbo Man. Arnold ends up calling the radio station because they need the 8 reindeer names, but Sinbad rips the phone line right out of the wall, and the studio, turns out, is right down the street, so they run there. Arnold, who's in better shape, ends up going in first, gets there faster, and he breaks into the booth with the DJ. The DJ calls 911 because there's a crazed dude sitting outside. Sinbad ends up showing up shortly later and claims to have a bomb that was sent through the mail. He was, of course, lying, and it was just a music box. The DJ didn't actually even have a Turbo Man in the studio, but has a certificate so you could pick one up eventually. Dude called the cops, so they show up, one being the same cop that Arnold has already seen multiple times. Again, Sinbad claims that he has a bomb. This works just long enough for these guys to get away, but a cop opens it, and it turns out it was a real freaking bomb. And of course, it's a comedy Christmas movie. Nobody's dying here, but dude ends up with hurt hands. Not so cool. Arnold ends up going back to his car, and he finds it's completely stripped, and he gets dropped off at his house. He sees Ted putting the star up on his tree through the window and decides he's going to go steal Johnny's Turbo Man as a little bit of vengeance. Liz gets Ted to take the star down. Arnold, after getting out of the house, decides he's got second thoughts about stealing this toy, and he goes to return it. But he ends up letting Ted's reindeer into the house and causes a small fire and a huge mess. Liz and Ted end up going into the house. They see Arnold in Ted's house with Johnny's Turbo Man in hand. They decide maybe things are a little too crazy, so they go to the parade together and they leave Arnold with the reindeer by themselves. They have a beer or two together, the reindeer and Arnold, kind of weird. He goes through and decides that Arnold's going to keep his promises. So on the way to the parade, the kids get dropped off with some friends, and the parents decide to go park. Ted tries to make a move on Liz because he's super into her, and Liz, not being into it, flings eggnog all over Ted. Arnold ends up seeing some of this, but he runs into that cop one more time, and he has to go on the run a little bit. He ends up ducking into this building that he finds, and the people inside think that he's the replacement actor for the Turbo Man guy who's supposed to be in the parade. This is where we see Curtis Armstrong. He's known for a whole lot of roles, pretty unique voice and a unique character he plays a lot of the time, but he is a chain-smoking booster, which is Turbo Man's pet tiger slash sidekick thing that's from the Turbo Man fictional show. Arnold ends up rising out of the top of the parade float, and he gets prompts from Booster on what to do because he's got no clue. And it turns out he gets to give away a special edition Turbo Man figure to one kid that happens to be at this parade. Sinbad ends up taking out the guy who was playing the Dementor, the villain of Turbo Man, and Arnold ends up picking his son to be the winner. Jamie wants to know how Turbo Man knew his name, because why would this random dude know his name? And Sinbad ends up rushing the float to get the doll. Sinbad punches Booster in the face, like straight up just bam. Booster flies off of the float, and he gets attacked by a whole bunch of kids. The suits have real gadgets that work for some reason, like a launcher that is on Turbo Man's arms to make him look like the figure, I guess, or work like the show. Jamie ends up running away, climbing up a building, being chased by Sinbad. The Turbo Man suit turns out to have a working jetpack. Like, this thing has a working fucking jetpack, and it is a parade costume. Absolutely nuts. What is going on in this universe where you need to have a working jetpack in the parade? Of course, he pulls out his trusty boomerang, though. Sokka would be proud.
Boomerang! You do always come back!
Throws it, whatever. Sinbad gets knocked to the ground and gets arrested. Arnold ends up flying up there, saving Jamie at the last second, and he's taken to his mom. But of course, Jamie's sad because his dad wasn't there to see how cool he was. But Arnold removes his helmet to show Jamie that he was his father and he's the one that saved him. Jamie goes through, gives the Turbo Man to Sinbad because he doesn't need a Turbo Man when he has the real one at home. And Arnold is carried off on the shoulders of the parade goers. Now, if you watched any of my videos, you know it's hard to disappoint me when it comes to watching a movie. So, no surprise that I had a total blast rewatching this Christmas classic. It might not be your typical Christmas classic movie, but I think in its own right, it's doing its own thing. And with this list of cameos that we've got, with all these different people that got to be in this movie, so awesome to see some familiar faces. You get to point out and be like, wait, is that who I think it is? Because it probably is. Now, stay tuned for Saturday, special Saturday, where we'll be covering the cartoon special, Grandma Got Ran Over by a Reindeer. Thanks for tuning in. Remember, some of us are born geeky. You have a good one.